This millionaire, who believed his wealth made him untouchable, set out to humiliate a janitor he thought was beneath him. Little did he know, the woman he insulted had a hidden talent, a gift so extraordinary it would change everything. And when the truth was revealed, he was the one left humiliated, realizing too late that some treasures can't be bought. The janitor's closet felt smaller than ever as Amelia leaned against the cold metal shelving, her breathing unsteady. Her hands were red and raw from hours of scrubbing floors, the sting of the harsh chemicals still clinging to her skin. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a dim glow over the cramped space filled with mops, buckets, and the acrid smell of bleach. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, but the memories she had buried so deeply clawed their way to the surface. It hadn't always been like this. 5 years ago, Amelia had stood on the grand stage of a concert hall, her fingers moving effortlessly over the keys of a gleaming Steinway piano. The audience had been silent, holding their breath as her music carried them into a world of emotion, a world she had crafted with every note. Applause thundered when she finished, the sound echoing in her chest as tears of pride welled in her eyes. She had dreamed of that moment since she was a child, practicing tirelessly on a second-hand keyboard her mother had bought from a pawn shop. It was her greatest triumph, the pinnacle of years of sacrifice and dedication. But triumph was fleeting. Her world had shattered in a single phone call. Her brother, her only family, had been struck by a car while walking home from work. The driver had been distracted, a split-second mistake that cost him everything. He survived, but the injuries left him unable to walk, his future confined to a wheelchair. Amelia had rushed to his side, abandoning rehearsals, auditions, and everything she had worked for. The medical bills piled up faster than she could count, draining her savings. Desperation clawed at her, and with no one else to turn to, she made the decision to sell her beloved piano, the one thing she thought she could never part with. The day she watched it being wheeled out of her apartment, a piece of her soul went with it. Now, years later, she found herself scrubbing floors in the towering Callahan Enterprises building. The hours were long, the work grueling, and the pay barely enough to keep her brother in therapy. But it was a job. It was survival. And for Amelia, survival was all she had left. The only respite came in fleeting moments when the office was quiet, and she could steal glances at the grand piano in the lobby, a gleaming black Steinway, much like the one she had lost. It sat behind a velvet rope, untouched except for the occasional cleaning. To most, it was just a decorative piece meant to impress wealthy clients. But to Amelia, it was a painful reminder of the life she had left behind. As she stood in the closet, the faint sound of voices reached her ears. The office was beginning to fill with employees, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. Among the chatter, one voice rose above the rest, sharp, commanding, and unmistakably cruel. Victor Callahan. Amelia's stomach tightened at the sound. Victor was the CEO of Callahan Enterprises, a man whose reputation for arrogance and ruthlessness preceded him. He moved through the building with the confidence of someone who believed the world was his to control. To him, everyone else was either a tool or an obstacle, and he treated those beneath him as if they were invisible, or worse, disposable. Amelia had seen him only a handful of times, usually from a distance. But each encounter had left her feeling smaller, as if his mere presence had the power to shrink her existence to nothing. She had learned quickly to keep her head down when he was near, to avoid drawing his attention at all costs. But that morning, fate had other plans. As she pushed her cleaning cart into the main lobby, Amelia froze. Victor stood by the elevator bank, surrounded by a group of executives. His voice carried across the space, sharp and biting as he berated one of his assistants for a scheduling error. The man, young and nervous, fumbled with his tablet, his face pale as he stammered apologies. Victor rolled his eyes, his expression one of pure disdain. Amelia kept her head low, her heart pounding as she moved to the far side of the lobby. She focused on her work, scrubbing the baseboards along the wall, hoping to remain unnoticed. But as she turned to grab a cloth from her cart, she accidentally knocked over a bottle of cleaning solution. The plastic container hit the floor with a loud clatter, the sound cutting through the room like a knife. The lobby fell silent. Victor's gaze snapped toward her, his piercing eyes locking onto her like a predator spotting prey. The group of executives followed his lead, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "You there," Victor barked, striding toward her. "Do you have any idea how much that floor costs? Or is that not something they teach in janitor school?" Amelia's cheeks flushed with heat as she scrambled to pick up the bottle. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." Victor smirked, his lips curling in a way that made her stomach churn. "I'll bet it won't," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Because if it does, you'll be out of here faster than you can say minimum wage." A few of the executives exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke. Victor's power was absolute, and no one dared to challenge him. Amelia kept her head down, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to remind him that she was more than just a janitor. But the words caught in her throat. Victor tilted his head, his smirk deepening. "What's the matter?" he asked mockingly. "Cat got your tongue? Or is silence part of your job description?" The humiliation burned like acid in her chest, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to stay silent. Victor let out a small, derisive laugh before turning on his heel and walking away, his entourage following close behind. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Amelia let out a shaky breath. Her hands trembled as she cleaned up the spilled solution, her mind racing with a mix of anger, shame, and despair. For years, she had endured humiliation, rejection, and loss. But this was something different. This was a reminder of how far she had fallen, of how the world saw her now, not as a person, but as a shadow. But somewhere deep inside her, beneath the layers of pain and doubt, a spark began to flicker. She didn't know it yet, but that spark was the beginning of something greater, something that would soon light the way to a redemption Victor Callahan would never see coming. The echo of Victor's mocking laughter lingered in Amelia's mind long after he disappeared into the elevator. She tried to push it aside, focusing on the work in front of her, but the humiliation clung to her like a second skin. The marble floor she had just cleaned reflected her weary face, a stark reminder of her place in this building, a place she had never truly belonged. As the day wore on, Victor's cruelty seemed to seep into every corner of her thoughts. She scrubbed, polished, and swept with mechanical precision, her body on autopilot while her mind raced. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, the years she had given up to care for her brother, and the dreams she had left behind. She thought of the life she might have had if things had been different. And, most painfully, she thought of the person she had once been, strong, confident, full of hope. That person felt like a ghost now, a distant memory overshadowed by the weight of survival. By the time the office emptied for the evening, Amelia was exhausted in every way imaginable. The chatter of the employees had faded, replaced by the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was her favorite time of day, when the world felt quiet and she could work without fear of being noticed. She moved through the empty lobby, her footsteps echoing against the high ceilings. The grand piano stood in its usual spot, gleaming under the soft overhead lights. Amelia's heart ached as she looked at it, her fingers twitching with the memory of how the keys used to feel beneath them. She hadn't played in years, but the longing had never left her. It was a part of her, buried deep but never truly gone. Her gaze lingered on the piano as she pushed her cleaning cart past it. She knew she shouldn't, but the temptation was too strong. She glanced around, making sure she was alone, before stepping over the velvet rope. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached the bench, the familiar scent of polished wood stirring something inside her. Slowly, she sat down, her hands trembling as she placed them on the keys. For a moment, she hesitated, afraid that the music would betray her, that her fingers would stumble, that she would find herself more distant from her gift than she had imagined. But when she pressed the first key, the sound was pure and clear, resonating through the empty space. She began to play, tentatively at first, but soon her hands found their rhythm. The melody that flowed from her was haunting and raw, a reflection of the pain she had carried for so long. It was a piece she had composed herself years ago, one she had never shared with anyone. The notes told a story of loss and resilience, of love and sacrifice, of a dream deferred but not forgotten. Amelia closed her eyes as the music consumed her, allowing herself to feel everything she had buried, every rejection, every humiliation, every moment of doubt. The pain poured out of her, transforming into something beautiful, something powerful. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't alone. Victor stood at the edge of the lobby, hidden in the shadows, his sharp eyes fixed on her. He had returned to the building to retrieve some forgotten paperwork, but the sound of the piano had stopped him in his tracks. At first, he thought it was a recording, a clever marketing tactic to impress clients. But as he approached, he saw her, his janitor, the woman he had mocked that morning, sitting at the piano and playing with a skill and emotion that left him speechless. He watched, transfixed, as her hands moved across the keys with effortless grace. The music was unlike anything he had heard before, raw and unpolished yet undeniably captivating. It stirred something inside him, something he didn't recognize, perhaps admiration, perhaps envy. He couldn't quite place it, but he knew he couldn't look away. When the final note faded into silence, Amelia opened her eyes, startled to find Victor standing there, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Her heart sank as she realized she had been caught. "Interesting," Victor said, his voice breaking the silence. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "I didn't know we had a concert pianist on staff." Amelia stood quickly, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I shouldn't have." "Relax," Victor interrupted, holding up a hand. "I'm not going to fire you. Though I probably should, considering you're not exactly paid to entertain yourself." His words stung, but Amelia held her ground. "I wasn't trying to entertain myself," she said quietly. I miss playing." Victor raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued despite himself. "Miss playing? What, you were some kind of prodigy before you decided to clean floors for a living?" Amelia hesitated, her instinct to stay silent warring with a desire to defend herself. "I studied music for most of my life," she said finally. "I was supposed to perform professionally. But things didn't work out." Victor tilted his head, his gaze sharp and probing. "Things didn't work out," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "Sounds like an excuse." Amelia clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "It's not an excuse," she said, her voice firmer now. "Sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices." Victor smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Sacrifices," he said, almost mockingly. "Well, maybe if you'd made better choices, you wouldn't be stuck here." The words cut deeper than she expected, but Amelia refused to let him see how much they hurt. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. "Maybe," she said simply. Victor stared at her for a moment longer before turning on his heel. "Get back to work," he said over his shoulder as he walked away. Amelia watched him leave, her hands trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. But as she sat back down at the piano, she realized something had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't just enduring Victor's cruelty, she was pushing back, even if only in small ways. And as her fingers found the keys again, she vowed to herself that she wouldn't let him, or anyone else, take away what little she had left. The next morning, the weight of the previous night's encounter hung over Amelia like a storm cloud. She moved through her routine mechanically, her hands scrubbing floors and wiping windows while her mind replayed Victor's words. Maybe if you'd made better choices, you wouldn't be stuck here. The cruelty in his tone had been deliberate, each word a barb meant to pierce her already fragile confidence. But as much as the insult stung, it also lit a small fire inside her, a flicker of defiance she hadn't felt in years. She had spent so long shrinking herself, trying to be invisible, that she had forgotten what it felt like to push back, even subtly. Last night, when she had met his gaze and refused to crumble, something had shifted. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The day dragged on, each task blending into the next. She kept her head down, avoiding any interaction that might draw unwanted attention. But no matter how much she tried to focus, the piano lingered in the back of her mind. It was a bittersweet temptation, her one connection to the life she had lost. And now, thanks to Victor, it was also a source of anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had plans for her, though whether they were benign or malicious, she couldn't say. By evening, the office was once again empty, the silence a balm for Amelia's frayed nerves. She finished her tasks quickly, eager to leave before Victor had any reason to return. But as she rolled her cleaning cart toward the supply closet, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "You're not leaving already, are you?" Amelia turned, her heart sinking as she saw Victor standing near the elevator. He was alone this time, his tie loosened and his jacket draped over his arm. There was a sharpness in his eyes, but also something else, curiosity, maybe, or amusement. "I've finished my work," she said quietly, keeping her tone neutral. Victor stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. "And here I thought you might give us another performance," he said, his smirk returning. Last night was surprising. Amelia's pulse quickened. She couldn't tell if he was mocking her or genuinely intrigued, but either way, she wanted nothing more than to disappear. "I don't think that's appropriate," she said, gripping the handle of her cart tightly. Victor tilted his head, studying her. "Appropriate," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Interesting choice, considering you didn't seem too concerned about that last night." Her cheeks flushed with heat. "I was alone," she said defensively. "I didn't think anyone would hear." "And yet I did," Victor said, his smirk widening. "And now I'm curious. Someone with your talent shouldn't be wasting away cleaning floors. Unless, of course, you enjoy it." The condescension in his voice was unbearable, but Amelia forced herself to remain calm. "I don't think my personal choices are any of your concern, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to so directly. "Fair enough," he said after a moment, a hint of amusement in his tone. "But humor me. Why is someone who can play like that working here?" Amelia hesitated, the question cutting deeper than she expected. She wanted to brush him off, to avoid giving him any more ammunition to use against her. But at the same time, she was tired of hiding, tired of pretending she was nothing more than the job she did. "I needed the money," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "My brother was in an accident. His medical bills were more than I could handle, so I did what I had to do." Victor's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by something unreadable. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Amelia continued. "Not that it matters," she said, her tone sharp now. "People like you don't understand what it's like to make sacrifices. You've never had to." Victor stiffened, his expression darkening. For a moment, The air between them was thick with tension. But then, to Amelia's surprise, he let out a low chuckle. "You're bold," he said, his smirk returning, though it lacked its usual venom. "I'll give you that." Amelia didn't respond. She was done playing his games, done letting him control the narrative. Without another word, she pushed her cart toward the supply closet, leaving Victor standing alone in the lobby. But as she reached the door, his voice called out to her once more. "Wait." She turned reluctantly, her patience wearing thin. "What now?" Victor walked toward her, his expression unreadable. When he stopped a few feet away, he crossed his arms over his chest. "I have an idea," he said, his tone lighter now, almost casual. "There's a charity gala next week. My company's hosting it. I need entertainment, and you clearly have the talent. So, how about it?" Amelia stared at him, stunned. "You want me to play at your gala?" Victor shrugged. "Why not? It's a win-win. You get to dust off those piano skills, and I get to impress some clients with an unexpected discovery." His smirk returned, more pronounced now. "Unless, of course, you're afraid." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and it sent a surge of anger through Amelia. She knew he was testing her, setting her up for some kind of public humiliation. But at the same time, a small part of her wanted to accept, wanted to prove to him, and to herself, that she was more than the janitor he dismissed so easily. After a long moment, she met his gaze, her chin held high. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it." Victor's smirk widened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. "Good," he said simply. "I'll have my assistant send you the details." As he turned and walked away, Amelia felt a mix of triumph and dread settle over her. She had taken his challenge, but at what cost? Whatever Victor had planned, she would face it head-on. And no matter what happened, she would remind him, and herself, of the woman she truly was. The week leading up to the gala was a whirlwind of emotions for Amelia. Every night after her shift ended, she stayed behind in the empty lobby, practicing on the grand piano. Her fingers were stiff from years of disuse, and at first, the notes stumbled and clashed, each mistake sending waves of frustration through her. But as the days passed, the music began to flow more freely, her hands remembering what her heart had never forgotten. Her emotions poured into every note she played. The anger she felt toward Victor for his arrogance. The grief of losing her old life. The desperation and love that had driven her sacrifices. It all blended into a haunting melody that filled the cavernous lobby with raw, unfiltered emotion. Though the thought of performing in front of a crowd, especially Victor's crowd, terrified her, she clung to the idea that this was more than just a performance. This was her chance to reclaim a piece of herself. What she didn't know was that Victor had been watching. From the upper floors of the building, where the offices were lined with glass walls, he often lingered late into the night, pretending to work while the faint strains of piano music reached his ears. He couldn't explain why he stayed to listen or why her music unsettled him so deeply. Maybe it was the vulnerability in the notes or the way they hinted at a depth he hadn't expected from someone he'd dismissed so easily. Whatever the reason, it gnawed at him, forcing him to confront questions he didn't want to ask. The night of the gala arrived faster than Amelia had anticipated. She stood backstage in a long black dress borrowed from a second-hand shop, her hands trembling as she adjusted the thin straps. She had cleaned herself up as best as she could, but she still felt out of place among the polished professionals and glittering chandeliers of the event. The room buzzed with conversation, the wealthy and powerful mingling as they sipped champagne and exchanged hollow pleasantries. Amelia peeked out from behind the curtain, her heart sinking as she spotted Victor at the center of the room, surrounded by his usual entourage. He was laughing, his confidence radiating like a beacon. She hated how effortlessly he fit into this world, while she felt like an imposter, teetering on the edge of humiliation. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're up in 5 minutes." She turned to see a young woman with a clipboard, her expression impatient. Amelia nodded, her stomach twisting into knots. This was it. The moment she had been dreading, and, in some small way, anticipating, since Victor had issued his challenge. As she made her way to the piano, the room fell quiet, the sudden shift in atmosphere sending a shiver down her spine. The spotlight illuminated her as she took her seat at the bench, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered above the keys. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her, the air thick with expectation. Victor, standing at the back of the room, leaned against the bar with a glass of whiskey in hand. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp gaze never left her. He had orchestrated this moment, and she knew he was waiting for her to falter, to confirm his belief that she didn't belong here. But as her fingers pressed the first key, something shifted. The melody she played was soft at first, tentative, like a whisper in the stillness. But as the music grew, so did her confidence. The notes wove together into a story, her story. Of loss and resilience, of love and sacrifice, of dreams deferred but never forgotten. Her hands moved with a grace she hadn't felt in years, each movement a declaration of who she was, of everything she had endured and overcome. The audience was captivated. Conversations ceased, glasses paused mid-air, and all eyes were fixed on the woman at the piano. The raw emotion in her music struck a chord with everyone in the room, cutting through the superficiality of the gala and reaching something deeper. Tears glistened in more than one pair of eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even Victor was caught off guard. He had expected competence, maybe even a touch of talent, but this was something else entirely. The music resonated with him in a way he didn't understand, stirring memories he had long buried. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, exposed, as if the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself were beginning to crack. When the final note faded into silence, the room erupted in applause. The sound was deafening, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls. Amelia sat frozen for a moment, her chest heaving as she tried to process what had just happened. Then she stood, bowing slightly, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Victor. He wasn't clapping. He stood motionless, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger or disdain. It was respect? Regret? Whatever it was, it unsettled her more than any insult he could have thrown her way. As she stepped off the stage, the crowd parted for her, strangers offering words of praise and admiration. But she barely heard them, her mind still reeling from the performance and the unexpected reaction it had provoked. Victor approached her as she reached the edge of the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the evening hanging heavily between them. Then he broke the silence. "You were incredible," he said, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. "I didn't expect that." Amelia met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "Maybe that's because you don't know me," she said, her tone steady but laced with defiance. Victor's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. Before he could respond, Amelia turned and walked away, her head held high. The applause still echoed in her ears, but it wasn't the crowd's approval she cared about. It was the knowledge that she had reclaimed a piece of herself, that she had proven, if only to herself, that she was more than the life she had been forced to lead. Behind her, Victor watched her go, a storm of emotions brewing in his chest. He had orchestrated this moment to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. But instead, she had risen above it, leaving him to confront the emptiness of his own choices. For the first time, he felt the sting of humiliation, and the bitter taste of regret. Amelia left the gala with her heart pounding, her emotions in turmoil. The applause still echoed in her ears, and the adrenaline coursing through her veins made everything feel surreal. She had done it. She had faced her fears, reclaimed her music, and, for a moment, stood in the light instead of the shadows. But as she walked home through the quiet, moonlit streets, doubts began to creep in. What would come next? The performance had been a triumph, yes, but it didn't change the fact that she still had to return to the life she'd been living. The life of a janitor, a life defined by sacrifice and survival. The weight of that reality pressed down on her, threatening to dim the spark of victory she had felt just hours ago. The next morning, Amelia arrived at the office building, her uniform neatly pressed but her nerves frayed. She didn't know what to expect. Would Victor gloat, reminding her that despite her talent, she still worked for him? Would he find a new way to humiliate her, using her performance as a weapon against her? The uncertainty was suffocating. As she stepped into the lobby, she was greeted with an unexpected sight. The staff, executives, assistants, even security guards, paused to watch her pass, their expressions a mix of awe and admiration. A few offered her quiet congratulations, their voices hushed but sincere. Amelia's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She wasn't used to being noticed, much less celebrated. She made her way to the janitor's closet, hoping to slip back into the routine that had always shielded her from the scrutiny of others. But as she reached for her cleaning supplies, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Amelia." She turned to see Victor standing in the doorway. He looked different today, less polished, more human. His tie was loose, and there was a weariness in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. "I need to talk to you," he said finally, his tone uncharacteristically soft. Amelia's guard went up immediately. "If this is about last night..." "It is," Victor interrupted, stepping into the room. "But not in the way you think." She folded her arms, her posture defensive. "What do you want, Mr. Callahan?" Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. "First of all, I owe you an apology. For everything. For the way I treated you, for underestimating you, for being an arrogant ass." Amelia blinked, caught off guard by the admission. She had expected condescension, maybe even mockery, but not this. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice cautious. Victor leaned against the doorframe, his gaze distant. "Because last night, you made me see something I've been avoiding for a long time. Your performance, it wasn't just good. It was extraordinary. And it made me realize how small I've been. I've spent my life measuring people by their usefulness to me, by their status, their wealth. But you shattered that." Amelia's chest tightened at his words, a mix of validation and confusion swirling inside her. "I don't need your pity," she said quietly. "This isn't pity," Victor said firmly. "It's recognition. You're more than I ever gave you credit for, and I hate that it took me this long to see it." Amelia looked away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You can't just say a few nice things and expect everything to be okay," she said. "You humiliated me. You made me feel small when all I was trying to do was survive." "I know," Victor said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am asking for a chance to make it right." Amelia frowned, her skepticism returning. "Make it right? How?" Victor straightened, his demeanor shifting as he pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "I have connections, people who can help you get back into the music world. You belong on a stage, Amelia, not scrubbing floors. Let me help you." She stared at him, the offer hanging in the air like a question she didn't know how to answer. It was everything she had wanted, everything she had sacrificed for. But accepting it from him felt complicated, tainted by their history. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care?" Victor hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I see too much of myself in you," he admitted. "Not who you are now, but who you could become if you let bitterness take over. I know what it's like to lose yourself, to let anger and pride consume you. And I don't want that for you." Amelia's breath caught at the vulnerability in his voice. For the first time, she saw a crack in the armor he wore so tightly, a glimpse of the pain he carried but never showed. It didn't excuse his actions, but it made him human. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But whatever you decide, just know that you don't have to do this alone." As he turned and walked away, Amelia felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, hope, confusion. The man who had spent months tearing her down was now offering her a lifeline, and she didn't know whether to take it or let it slip through her fingers. That night, as she sat at the piano in the empty lobby, her fingers moving over the keys, she thought about everything Victor had said. She thought about her brother, about the sacrifices she had made, and about the spark of defiance she had felt when she stood up to Victor for the first time. The melody she played was soft but resolute, a reflection of the choice she knew she had to make. Because no matter what happened next, one thing was certain: she wouldn't let anyone define her worth ever again. The days following Victor's unexpected offer were a blur of emotions for Amelia. She found herself torn between the weight of his words and the scars of his actions. Every time she replayed their conversation in her mind, she felt a flicker of hope, followed by a surge of doubt. Could she trust him? Did he truly want to help her, or was this just another game, a way to manipulate her into letting her guard down? Amelia buried herself in work, trying to distract herself from the decision looming over her. But no matter how much she scrubbed, swept, or polished, the questions gnawed at her. She couldn't deny the sincerity she had seen in Victor's eyes that day, but the walls she had built around herself were not so easily torn down. Her brother, Daniel, noticed the shift in her demeanor during one of their weekly visits. Sitting across from him in the small rehabilitation center's common room, Amelia struggled to focus on their conversation. Daniel, ever perceptive, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "You've been quiet today," he said gently. "What's going on?" Amelia hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Daniel had always been her confidant, the one person who truly understood her. But even with him, admitting the truth felt daunting. "It's complicated," she said finally, avoiding his gaze. Daniel tilted his head, giving her the look he always did when he knew she was holding back. "Amelia, I've known you my entire life. You can't fool me. Talk to me." With a deep breath, she recounted everything: the gala, the performance, Victor's offer, and the conflict raging inside her. As she spoke, Daniel listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to quiet contemplation. When she finished, he leaned back in his wheelchair, his hands resting in his lap. "It sounds like this guy has a lot to make up for," he said after a moment. "But it also sounds like he's trying." Amelia frowned, her chest tightening. "You think I should trust him?" Daniel shrugged. "I think you should trust yourself. Look, I get why you're hesitant. He's hurt you, and you have every right to protect yourself. But if this is an opportunity to get back to the life you've always wanted, maybe it's worth considering." His words hit her like a jolt of electricity. For years, she had put everyone else's needs ahead of her own, convinced that her dreams no longer mattered. But hearing Daniel, her reason for sacrificing so much, encourage her to take a chance stirred something inside her. Later that night, as Amelia sat at the piano in the empty lobby, her thoughts swirled like a storm. The keys beneath her fingers felt familiar yet foreign, a bridge between the life she had lost and the one she was still trying to build. She played softly, letting the music guide her as she wrestled with the decision she knew she had to make. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the building's glass walls, she had made up her mind. The next day, Amelia approached Victor's office with a mixture of determination and apprehension. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. A moment later, Victor's voice called out, "Come in." She stepped inside, finding him seated at his desk, surrounded by papers and a half-empty cup of coffee. He looked up, his expression unreadable, as she closed the door behind her. "I've thought about your offer," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Victor leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. "And? I'll accept your help," she said, her words measured. "But on one condition." His eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm listening." Amelia took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't charity. If I do this, it's because I've earned it, not because you feel guilty or want to redeem yourself." Victor nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Fair enough," he said. "But for the record, I'm not offering this out of guilt. I'm offering it because you're talented, and the world deserves to see that." His words caught her off guard, but she refused to let them sway her. She had made her decision, and now it was time to follow through. Over the next few weeks, Victor kept his promise. He connected Amelia with a renowned music coach, arranged for her to perform at exclusive events, and even helped her secure a scholarship to a prestigious music program. True to her word, Amelia approached each opportunity with relentless determination, proving herself at every turn. Their interactions remained professional, but there were moments when the barriers between them began to blur. Victor often lingered during her rehearsals, his usually cold demeanor softening as he watched her play. At first, she found his presence unnerving, but over time, she began to see glimpses of the man beneath the arrogance, the man who had once been lost, just as she had. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Victor approached her as she packed up her sheet music. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Amelia," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I just wanted to say, thank you." She frowned, confused. "For what?" "For giving me a chance to make things right," he said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." For a moment, Amelia didn't know how to respond. The vulnerability in his voice was unexpected, and it stirred something she hadn't felt toward him before, a flicker of understanding. "I didn't do it for you," she said honestly. "I did it for me." Victor smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with something close to respect. "Fair enough." As she left the rehearsal space that night, Amelia felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She was no longer the woman who had been humiliated, rejected, or defined by her circumstances. She was Amelia, strong, resilient, and finally stepping into the life she was meant to live. The night of Amelia's grand debut arrived, and the world seemed to hold its breath. She stood backstage at one of the most prestigious concert halls in the city, the same stage she had dreamed of performing on years ago. The hall was packed with an audience of critics, musicians, and elite guests, all gathered for the sold-out event. The air buzzed with anticipation, but Amelia's mind was quiet. For the first time in a long time, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Dressed in an elegant gown that flowed like liquid silver, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. This moment wasn't about proving Victor wrong or redeeming her past. It was about reclaiming her identity, honoring her sacrifices, and showing the world, and herself, who she truly was. The stage manager gave her a nod, and the lights dimmed. The audience quieted, the rustling and murmurs fading to an expectant hush. Amelia stepped into the spotlight, the grand piano gleaming under the warm glow. She paused, taking in the sea of faces before her, then sat at the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, before she began. The first note rang out, rich and resonant, carrying with it a wave of emotion that swept through the hall. The piece she played was her own, a composition born from the depths of her pain, resilience, and transformation. It was a symphony of her life, each movement telling a chapter of her journey. The music rose and fell like a tempest, fierce and unrelenting, before softening into moments of haunting beauty. It was raw, vulnerable, and unapologetically hers. As her fingers danced across the keys, the audience was spellbound. Tears glistened in their eyes, their hearts laid bare by the power of her music. Amelia poured everything into the performance, her anger, her sorrow, her love, and her triumph. The notes seemed to carry the weight of every rejection, every sacrifice, and every moment of quiet strength that had brought her to this point. In the shadows of the balcony, Victor watched in stunned silence. He had seen her practice, heard glimpses of her talent, but this was something else. The arrogance he had clung to for so long dissolved in the face of her brilliance. For the first time, he realized the depth of what he had almost destroyed, the sheer magnitude of the person he had underestimated. A lump rose in his throat, and for once, he didn't fight it. The final notes of the piece hung in the air, shimmering like stars, before fading into silence. For a moment, the hall was still, as if no one dared to breathe. Then the applause erupted, a thunderous roar that shook the walls. The audience rose to their feet, their cheers and whistles echoing like a symphony of their own. Amelia stood and bowed, her chest heaving as she took in the overwhelming response. The applause washed over her like a wave, but what mattered most was the peace she felt within herself. This was her moment, not as a janitor, not as someone broken by life's hardships, but as the artist she had always been. As she stepped off the stage, the applause still ringing in her ears, she found Victor waiting in the wings. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, pride, humility, and something close to reverence. "You were extraordinary," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Amelia met his gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "I know." Victor let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "You deserve this, Amelia. All of it. And more." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her tone sincere. "But I got here because I worked for it. Because I never gave up. Not because of you." Victor nodded, the words hitting him with a truth he couldn't deny. "I know," he said. "But I'm glad I got to witness it." Amelia gave him one last look, then turned and walked away, her head held high. She didn't need his validation, nor anyone else's. The applause of the audience, the accolades of the critics, none of it mattered as much as the knowledge that she had found her way back to herself. Outside the concert hall, the night air was crisp and cool, the city alive with lights and energy. Amelia stood for a moment, taking it all in. She felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders, replaced by a lightness she hadn't known in years. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she would create, inspire, and thrive. A chapter where she would embrace her worth and her talent, never again allowing anyone to diminish her. As she walked down the steps, the city stretching out before her, she felt a surge of joy unlike anything she had ever known. Amelia wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, boldly, brilliantly, and unapologetically. And no one, not even Victor Callahan, could take that away from her.